From the United Nations Office to the African Union, this is She Stands for Peace, a podcast series where I explore the state of the women, peace and security agenda in Africa through a series of conversations with key actors. In the podcast, we ask the central question, 20 years after UNSCR 1325, how far have we come? I am Dr. Yemisi Akimbubala, your host, and today I'm joined by Ms. Ilze Brands Kehris, the UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. Ilze Brands Kehris joins me from New York, and we have a conversation about human rights, peace building, and the women, peace and security agenda. Ms. Ilze Brands Kehris, it's a pleasure to speak with you today. Now, you have over 20 years of experience in human rights work with expertise in political science and conflict prevention and human rights with specialization in minority rights. In January 2020, you started your role as Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. Tell us about your journey getting where you are today.
Well, it's been a lot of years, as you say, so the journey is long, but I must say that I think it has given me advantage to have a background that also started off in political science, because it was really sort of the development and the changing of systems. In my case, it was also looking at the broader European region and the East European changes in the beginning of the 90s with the huge reforms and the democratization, the transition societies, that made me realize how closely connected sort of the welfare of society is and democracy, peace, security to human rights, that you really cannot do it without human rights. It's such a core part of the transition that is there, and also the respect across the world that needs to be there, particularly focusing on how we measure that. How do we look at that? There are many, many problems in most societies. In all societies, we have some, certainly. But looking at the situation of minorities is usually, as we know from much bigger thinkers than I am, is an indicator of how society overall is doing. So the inclusion of minorities in a very real way, the real participation, the openness of society to respect the rights of everyone in society. And I think this is something that brought me to that combined focus on social development, on stability, peace and security, conflict prevention, but really based on human rights. And then I have worked various situations regionally in many countries, both monitoring compliance with rights frameworks specifically, but also developing more broader guidance and at this sort of higher policy level and strategically as well. So it's a true privilege after all of those combined background situations brought me to this position I'm in now that I really hope gives me the chance to contribute at the global level as well, building on that experience.
And picking on what you said about participation, there are many cases of reprisals, intimidation of people who cooperate with the United Nations in its efforts to protect people's rights. We saw an increase of these cases online during the pandemic. So, for example, in Algeria, we had the case of Olaya Zahadi, who was wife of Fidel Breaker. And Fidel Breaker was imprisoned, but intimate photos and videos of his wife were put online to intimidate her. And there are also cases of reprisals against journalists in countries like DRC, Liberia, Cameroon, and other countries. And in response to this general increase in retaliation and intimidation during the pandemic, you said, and I quote you, that the new circumstances in which we find ourselves require more voices at the table, not fewer. If we are to rise to the occasion, we must be creative in developing new ways or transforming the existing methods for our partners to cooperate freely and safely with the UN. So, reflecting on the last 18 months, what are some of the critical lessons for human rights defenders, activists, agencies in making defending human rights safer? What are some of these new creative approaches and methods in the context of conflict-affected areas?
Yes, well, I really thank you for that question and for starting off with that question, because again, it brings the focus on the individuals and particularly on those extremely powerful and courageous individuals at the front lines who really are risking to improve the situation of themselves or their groups and their whole societies. And it is sad, as you said. Also, I have the mandate that the Secretary General has given me, as he did to my predecessor, of being responsible for the UN approach overall to reprisals for cooperation with the UN. So the number one thing to remember, of course, is that the UN, the way the work we're doing, and certainly on human rights, we cannot do it without real participation by individuals, by civil society organizations, and by human rights defenders. That's really the direct link to the reality. So it's obvious that we need that cooperation, and we also need to protect that cooperation. Now, generally, it's true that we have seen over the years already, we've heard a lot about the various restrictions globally put on civic space and civil society in many worrisome ways. But we did see during COVID that some of those became worse. And as you said, you pointed particularly also to the increase in online harassment that particularly women and girls have experienced. But that's certainly one area that we are following very closely. But in general, also during COVID, we had the situation where the kinds of restrictions that were put into place have to be weighed in terms of the legitimacy, because of course there's a legitimate aim also in protecting public health protection and other legitimate purposes. But sometimes, or quite often, we would see some member states really using the occasion of COVID of introducing even stronger restrictions, and certainly more strong than were needed or necessary in the situation. On online activities, we've seen also there is not just the harassment, but various forms of surveillance, for instance, that has increased as well, but also in other cases, of course, where the movement was restricted and in other ways, the effects, particularly the abuse, I would say, the overuse of national security arguments and counterterrorism arguments. Those narratives and those were very often used by some member states in the context of COVID. And then, of course, the risk is that those types of restrictions and the new legislation, frameworks, and policies adopted go on. So that's, I think, we really need to see that even though we had all of those challenges before, we really have to rise to the next level and try to see how we do this. Now, there is always room for being more creative. So this was part of what you quoted as my call to all of us to keep thinking together how to do this. But I think that part of this new approach that we have taken really also came already right around before COVID put these restrictions in place in February last year, when the Secretary General launched his call to action for human rights. And in that, there is a very strong one of the key areas or key themes that was pointed to that needed concerted UN effort and effort by everyone was really civic space. And in that context, we have issued a system-wide guidance for the promotion and protection of civic space. And this is something that is done for the first time. It may sound surprising, but of course, many parts of the UN have their cooperation with civil society, and therefore also the experience, sadly, of reprisals against those who cooperate with the UN. But there never was a system-wide guidance. And this, I think, is one of the lessons and something we look to, and that call to action overall on human rights really reminds everyone of, that the UN is in this together. We need to have the joint effort and speak with one voice and act in a coherent way across the board on human rights, putting human rights at the center of all action by the UN, but in particular then also this focus on the civic space, and that participation, the key point of the participation. We have the 3 Ps, as we call them, in that civic space guidance, and that is really the participation, effective, meaningful, that it really has to be there and across the board at all levels. The promotion of freedom of expression, of all of the freedoms, the association, assembly that needs to be there for that to be able to take place. And the protection also of civil society actors and the space. So this is something that is sort of approaches that build on what we've done before, but that is a new approach in its coherence and in really going ahead and really calling on everyone to do it across all pillars. And then it comes to, looking at peace and security as well.
Absolutely. Now, looking specifically at Africa now, Could you give us some examples of national, regional, and international mechanisms to protect and promote human rights before, during, and post conflict in Africa?
Let me start maybe by saying in general that there are a lot of frameworks, and this goes, by the way, for Africa as well as for the international level and for all our regions as well. But also in Africa, there are a lot of regional frameworks, rights frameworks, legally binding ones. There are policies. There continues to be an effort put into making practical recommendations and guidances. But as everywhere across the world on human rights, the issue is implementation. But in general, and for us, I also wanted to say that I wanted to thank the UNOAU very much for this interview, because we are also very keen on the cooperation, the excellent cooperation that we have with the African Union, as a UN overall, of course, but particularly as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I think this is a very important way also where we feed into each other's experiences and we share and we go, develop further together and we provide maybe examples from what we've seen elsewhere in that can be useful in the context, but we also learn from the experience of African Union across the board. And this is, of course, also, again, with a very comprehensive framework, both legal and policy framework that already is in place. It's, of course, fundamentally, as we all know, there is the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. And that is from 1986, so a while ago, but not that long ago. So it's still fresh and strong and powerful to build on. And it really is a foundational human rights treaty on the African continent. And I would add to that again that it is partly also because it's relatively new. There's so much progressive content in the charter, and something that certainly the world can look to and benefit from as well. And that in itself was already an effort, a collective effort by many participants. That established, as we know, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And that's a very important commission. Again, we need to learn the regional commissions, not only from Africa, but elsewhere. We also, I think it's very important when we look at the global level that we also make sure that there's coherence and that we look at what's happening at the regional level and learn from it. But certainly the African Commission is very important. And then at the end of the 90s, 99, I believe, the special rapporteur on the rights of women was appointed. And that was particularly important also because it is a mechanism that also includes from the Commission the possibility of receiving complaints. We know, of course, that the Charter prohibits discrimination, obviously, and as many constitutions do in any case, including on the basis of sex. And it also obliges state parties to actually eliminate all forms of discrimination against women and to ensure the protection of women's rights. The special rapporteur I mentioned did a lot of advocacy, and civil society did as well. And therefore, we then have the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the rights of women in Africa, the Maputo Protocol, as we call it. And that one was adopted a few years later in 2003. And that's interesting to see as well, that it actually has the provisions are parallel and almost identical to the CEDAW Convention's provisions, but they really expand the legal protection of women. We do have the interesting point of the Maputo Protocol, and considering that we're talking in the context also of conflict and armed conflict, potential and post-conflict, and so on, that we do have concrete provisions there on women in peace processes and the protection of women also in armed conflict, and that's extremely important, of course. We have the women's right to peaceful existence, but also the stress. So this is the protection of women as one category, but also very much stressing where we started off, which is the participation, very importantly, to make sure that there is full and effective participation. both in peace process, and then of course we come later to the participation throughout all society and at all levels of decision making and political participation as well. But there we have again, there we have the protection of women in armed conflicts, where that specifically focuses on conflict settings and the responsibilities. Let's remember the obligation of the states parties to ensure that that protection is there, and also the responsibility to look at particularly vulnerable women and girls. We need to remember always the diversity, not just in the different groups we have in society, but even when we talk about women and girls who are very much exposed overall as a group, but of course they are even more vulnerable subgroups of women and girls. So that's a very important aspect to have as well, this intersectionality of looking at maybe minority women or women with disabilities and or various other combinations. And there we have 42 AU member states that have ratified this protocol. That's out of 49 signatory states. And that's really a huge number. This is something we should see as something that's very positive and encouraging. However, and that's the sad part, coming back to the implementation, that even the obligation, once you ratify, that you should be reporting. So there, unfortunately, they are supposed to, the member states or those who have ratified, to report every 2 years. And as of now, we only have 4 countries that have submitted their reports to the African Commission under that protocol. And that again goes to, of course, the issue that we need to really strengthen that engagement and to make sure that it's seen in the very constructive way that it's done, that actually it is to assist the member states. We do have the human rights mechanisms, of course, that we have, of course, also on the African Committee on the Experts of Rights and Welfare of the Child, that also relevant in this case for girls, of course, but also as an example of other works that is being done there, and other mechanisms that have done a lot of very important research that has been provided. And I think that brings a very important point, which is that we cannot do this work unless they have the evidence and the analysis from the situation. So the research is an extremely important part of this. Data, as we know, that is a very big, and we may come back to the gaps and challenges, but that is one that we have globally, but certainly also in the case of Africa, where we very often don't have the necessary disaggregated data we need to have to be able to actually really specify where the issues are and the problems are. They also have the regional mechanisms, have adopted various resolutions on the status in human rights in particular countries, particularly some of them, of course, in conflict-related or post-conflict situations. So we have a long series of ones with Mali, Burundi, CAR, Nigeria, Niger, Rwanda, Sudan, Liberia, Guinea-Bissau, the list goes on. But the good point is that there is attention, individual attention, that looks at also the status of the implementation of the recommendation then, and as it should. And that's where I come back to that. I'm sorry to repeat myself, but it's not clear what the impact therefore are on improving, as of yet, on improving the human rights, because there's more work that needs to be done in following up on those very clear recommendations that are done there. But in addition to this, we also have the special rapporteur on the rights of women in Africa, who does go specifically, and I personally find this extremely important, can undertake a fact-finding mission, and that's part of the mandate. And that's, again, with all of the different information that we need, and some of it is reported through documents and research, as I mentioned, that is done, but it's very important to also be able to do that kind of fact-finding and to have the direct contact and get. So that's a very good, strong part of the mandate. We do have, of course, as we all know as well, the African Court on Human and People's Rights, a very important institution that has very important decisions in many areas of human rights. But it has been operational since 2006 or so. But there's only been so far one case on women's rights. So that also is an indicator, I guess, that there could be more. There's room for strategic litigation, let's say. There is a lot of room for activists to maybe see what can be used in this, because the more we get of those kinds of court decisions and jurisprudence, of course, the better it is then also in guiding others and in actually finding violations if that is the case, so that they really have to be addressed under the obligation to have that.
There is a lot of mechanisms and policies and everything in place, the right ones in place to support and protect human rights across Africa. But the universal periodic review on human rights records of all UN member states still shows substantial human rights violations in many countries. And like you said before, human rights monitoring analysis is one of the core activities of the High Commissioner's Office on Human Rights. And we understand there is no singular method or formula in addressing and fixing the human rights thing. But how would you like to see better cooperation and coordination locally in member states working with the UN as we work towards the next few years following the pandemic?
I think that's absolutely a key issue that you put your finger on. We have a lot of experiences at the country level, also for the UN, in country teams where different parts of the UN are working on very important agendas that can have intersecting parts, like when we're talking about this particular issue. And certainly women's rights gender equality is a cross-cutting issue to begin with, globally as well, but certainly women and girls in conflict settings and peace building and all of this huge agenda in itself. But they haven't always, let's say in the past, they've been so busy working on their own specific tasks and mandates that we haven't always seen a complete sort of coherent coming together and working together on these cross-cutting agendas. And there, I do think that we have a wonderful opportunity now for several reasons to do that. I mean, for us, it's always been the case where we are present, either in country offices or when we're part of our country teams or components in peace missions, for instance, that it shouldn't be just human rights that the human rights people work on, and that then, and we have UN Women, of course, it's hugely important for the work on women and girls, and also the other special rapporteurs that have their particular mandates. But how do we really make sure that we come together and are stronger together, so that we don't duplicate work, but we reinforce the work we're doing, and we're doing more coherently and strategically? And I think this is something that we learned with COVID, or it was really a wake-up call in many ways. And I mentioned already the call to action of the Secretary General. I'm very lucky to have been designated, together with the ASG Volker Turk from the Executive Office of the Secretary General, to oversee the implementation of the call to action. And that is, the importance of that is precisely because it is across all the UN, as I was mentioning. So all the entities and agencies are part of that. And we did see a coming together during COVID because of the urgency of the situation. I think that the last year showed that the UN really was very good in coming together in all of its different parts, with all of its different perspectives and added analyses, but really coming together for common action. And I think that has been strengthened. And the intention of the call to action is, of course, exactly that as well. And we've been able to follow through, and just recently had a follow-up meeting with the Secretary General on what has been done under the call to action over the last year, where we also had that message reinforced, that it's the leadership across the board. So that comes to the country teams that you're talking about, on asking about, where I think that that's a wonderful opportunity now, where we have the call to action. We learned from COVID-19 response how necessary it is. But with the call to action, we have the opportunity, under the leadership there of the resident coordinator, to bring together the country team and making sure that all of the different parts of the UN that are represented in the country come together and identify the priorities for human rights. And of course, they will include, I can say almost without any exception, I would say without an exception, they will have, of course, women and girls very much as part of the agenda. And that is part of the call to action in any case. And that's one way that we feel that this call to action can be leveraged both by all of us, not just the Office of the High Commissioner, by everyone, to make sure that the team comes together for it, but also in our interaction with the member states, with the governments, with the authorities, and saying we really speak in one voice, we convene in one voice, we have identified these priorities, and the message is there from all of us. It also is parallel to the other review of the integration, as we have had in going on for a few years, and that we recently came to some conclusions on the importance exactly of making sure, and where maybe there have been some obstacles, where there are some remaining obstacles in making sure that the country teams really come together and work together from all of the different parts. So that's something I think is extremely important, and something that we now have the opportunity to really follow up on and strengthen.
Now, OHCHR has done a lot of work in conflict globally, but within Africa, have you been able to address human rights issues for women and girls?
First of all, we have, of course, great cooperation with the African Union, so that and again, there are various ways at the policy level. We have memoranda of understanding that we've made on human rights, and the human rights work that we continue to work on. We also have the frameworks that have been already taken on board for peace and security, for instance, and development, where we're now about to finally, we hope, sign also for the UN overall, the cooperation framework, the overall also for the for human rights. So that of course very strongly includes as well the focus on women and girls and women's rights overall. But we work at all different levels, because we also have, of course, where we have our presences, that we work at the country level very clearly as well in assisting in developing plans, in reporting and monitoring, as you mentioned, is one of the key functions, of course, that a human rights presence has, but also in assisting the authorities to develop response plans, to develop, making sure that there are systematic action plans, but also addressing very specific problems, whether they are also looking at both the legislation, the institutions that are in place, but also how that cooperation, for instance, with civil society and women's organizations can be facilitated, where we also, in those presences that we very much have also been part of that. I think the importance, again, on stressing all of the different levels, so that they could be maybe, in specific country examples, it's very contextual, obviously, of what is being done. But I also think that sadly, where we have the monitoring and the reporting on issues like sexual gender-based violence and conflict-related violence too, there is, of course, a very specific methodology that we need to apply and use, that we are able to, again, provide very reliable information, and that also we then cooperate with other parts of the UN, so that really gains the attention and really gets the focus it has as well.
So, within the context of Africa, what have you identified in terms of lessons and gaps which need to be addressed in order to protect women, girls, and human rights defenders in the continent?
We keep gathering information, first of all, and I think that is number one, that we know that there is underreporting of situations where defenders are threatened, intimidated, harassed, or experience reprisals for the reporting, the work that they're doing on human rights and women's and girls' rights, and also in particular then in that mandate also for the cooperation when they, for instance, tell the UN about this. So that's one, just as the implementation on the side of the recommendations that I kept stressing is a problem, then of course this is one issue that is a big gap, not only in Africa, but also in Africa. I guess one can even, without much risk, have the hypothesis that the more violent the situation, the more at risk, of course, are women and girls, but also the more is it likely that the reports we get are way underreported, and we know this is the truth. So this is something that we of course need to work on, making sure that we are trying to help to make sure that the country teams, and in particular the human rights components and our colleagues in the field, have the tools to understand how they can, as much as possible, safeguard the human rights defenders that they're interacting with. And there's we've had workshops on this, and we are interacting. We have guidances, we have tools specifically, but it takes also some experience. It's extremely sensitive information. We know that it can put many people at very severe risk to have the interaction. So there's some very practical guidances there on how to communicate, what kind of telephone to use, not to keep numbers recorded in your telephones, not to keep messages that have gone back and forth, potentially using another telephone number. Sometimes, for our colleagues in the field to try to see how they meet up with human rights defenders, that maybe there is a need at times. Sometimes we've had good examples from some countries where they found that they could find a different spot for meeting up, so that, because sometimes the UN premises themselves may be under surveillance and it's better to meet someplace else. How that meeting takes place, or going, for instance, in some country, we had an example of making sure that the meetings took place in marketplaces, because there you have a situation with lots of people. So at least and by talking then to several people, you may diffuse, so the attention is not just maybe on one individual, even if that's the source that you need for that. So there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that all of those interlocutors themselves understand the risks, are able to also explain to the defenders what the risks are and how to, and then to take mitigating measures. And if worst comes to worst, to really make sure that we have a tool set of direct interventions that need to be there to protect the defenders. They are our heroes. We really not only need them, but we deeply admire them. So very much something we will continue to work on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for doing the interview. Now, to end the interview, we've spoken about your professional insight on human rights across the world. So, tell us an interesting fact about you that people won't find on Google.
To be honest with you, I have never checked what can be found about myself on Google, because I'm not, I don't know what is there or not. But I think that one thing I would like to share maybe is that my own personal experience is growing up both privileged and not privileged. Privileged because I was born in Sweden. I grew up in Sweden, and I think that's privileged in itself, because that's a safe environment. It's an environment that, yes, of course, there's a violence in all societies, but generally speaking, of course, there's stability in institutions, and it's a safe environment, and many other factors. But I was born there because my parents came as refugees from Latvia during the Second World War, and then of course stayed on until their children eventually were born there. And I think that was also this experience, and maybe that led to this interest as well in a minority experience, that you are sort of, because Sweden in those days when I was born was a very cohesive society, and not a very diverse society. And as luckily has become much more diverse, and certainly very open to that diversity these days. But it was even there, it's this sense of sort of being under pressure, that you should be conforming somehow to a pre-existing way of being, was something that I think colored, and multilingualism, and just the awareness that there are different ways and different cultures, I think is something that is profoundly important to me, and that has led me towards the path of minority rights, inclusion, participation, and really the integration of societies, which I always stress. It's not integration into a society, it's integration of societies, of all of its different parts, into one whole, because we all contribute.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for doing the interview. It's been a pleasure listening to you. You have been listening to She Stands for Peace, the podcast series that explores the state of the women, peace, and security agenda in Africa, asking the central question: 20 years after UNSCR 1325, how far have we come? I'm Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, your host, and this podcast was produced by the United Nations Office to the African Union with the generous support of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs.